It's typically a night for childhood fun and adventure.
It was about 2011. I was just going to take my kids out trick-or-treating.
A time for candy and costumes.
Masks and capes and that kind of stuff.
But that Halloween, for one California community, not all the monsters were make-believe.
She had 10 stab wounds. It was excessively violent.
It was obviously a brutal crime. It was just vicious.
The victim is a beloved mother of 4.
My mom loved doing things for other people and helping people.
She was one of the sweetest ladies that you could talk to.
The brutal murder sends shockwaves through the community.
They lived in a good neighborhood, in a quiet neighborhood, but here you have a dead woman on Halloween night.
And the terror intensifies as the investigation leads down a chilling path.
We found masks like Jason would wear in the Friday the 13th movies.
He did believe he was either possessed with or seeing demons.
And before it's all over, one family will be forced to confront the evil in their midst.
I never in a million years expected that he would suddenly go from dependent and manipulative to suddenly violent.
Manteca, California, October 31st, 2011. It's Halloween in this town of 75,000, over an hour east of San Francisco Bay.
Manteca is a little bit more than a suburb. It's actually become a suburb of the Bay Area, which is crazy.
And as darkness begins to fall that evening, parents rush home from work to ready the candy and costumes. Parents like Detective Wayne Miller with the Manteca Police.
I just got home from working my regular shift and just going to take my kids out trick-or-treating.
But what the community of Manteca doesn't know as they head out that night for a little lighthearted fun with the kids is that this Halloween, the terror will be real. And so will the blood and gore. It's just before 6 o'clock that evening when Caitlin McGehee tries to wake her mother, Kathleen.
Caitlin knocks on her mother's bedroom door, which is shut. Her mother doesn't answer.
The fact that her 55-year-old mother doesn't respond worries Caitlin.
Mom is on the edge of diabetes. She might have some insulin issues. Maybe the diet she's on has backfired and she might have fainted.
And her fear intensifies as she tries the door again.
She knocked louder and called her mom. There was no response. And she tried the door knob and found it was locked.
That's when Caitlin starts to panic.
Her mom doesn't usually lock the door when she's taking a nap. So by this time, she's kind of pounding on the door and no response.
She does go around to the outside of the house to try to look into the window. She's not able to see. The blinds are drawn.
Unsure what to do, Caitlin calls her older brother, Justin.
And I said, Caitlin, I'm on my way. Hang up the phone and call the police right now.
911. Hi, my mother has been in her room with the door locked. She's not responding when I knock on the door, and she's diabetic and prone to sleep apnea. I'm just worried something's wrong with her. Okay.
Ambulance company and fire department both responded. There, they were able to remove the lock from the door.
And moments later, as he's racing to the scene, Justin McGehee gets a second call from his sister.
She was sobbing so hard I couldn't understand what she was saying, but eventually it became clear that she was saying she's dead.
Not only is Justin and Caitlin's mother dead, what greets the first responders beyond her locked door is a scene straight out of a slasher movie.
They found Kathleen McGehee in the bedroom, lying on her back with multiple stab wounds to her torso and neck.
Based on the amount of blood that is around the body, this was definitely a crime scene.
But who would want to murder a beloved mother of 4?
She was one of the sweetest ladies that you could talk to.
And even more mysteriously, did the date have something to do with her death?
Here you have a dead woman on Halloween night. It was eerie.
Like a lot of upper-middle-class families in suburban Manteca, the McGees had moved in from elsewhere.
They were from the Bay Area, and they had, I think, been here about 10 years.
Kathleen and her husband, Tom, had met when they were in college.
Mom and Dad were going to 2 different universities or colleges at the time, and they were each involved in sort of a Christian fellowship ministry.
Although for Kathleen and Tom, fellowship turned into something more.
It didn't take them very long to decide that we're supposed to be together.
The couple got married and moved to Chicago soon after.
My dad went to Moody Bible Institute. He learned Greek. It's nice to be able to read the old manuscripts yourself. So I was born while they were over there.
A second son followed, and to support their growing family, Tom put his dreams of the ministry on hold.
They moved back to California, and we're here ever since.
Back in California, Tom put his knack for languages to work.
The father is an international businessman.
Tom worked a lot out of the country.
He was gone the majority of the time, months at a time, and then would come home for a period of time and be gone on another trip.
Meanwhile, Kathleen was a stay-at-home mom. Once in California, the couple had 2 more children. Third son, Dawson, born in 1985, and daughter, Caitlin, the youngest.
Mom loved being pregnant. She loved having babies. She loved having kids. She was a very nurturing person.
And she devoted all of her time to raising the kids.
When we became old enough for school, they decided to homeschool us. My mom continued to be a stay-at-home mom, but she was also, if you will, a teacher of 4 different grades.
Kathleen excelled at it too, if her bright and talented children were any indication.
They were all very intelligent. They were musicians. All of them played some sort of instrument, if not many instruments.
And in the mid-90s, Kathleen and Tom moved the family to Manteca.
They wanted to own a home. They couldn't afford that in the Bay Area.
Over the next decade, the kids all grew up and left for college.
Once my mom didn't have a bunch of kids running around the house to take care of, I kind of wondered what she was going to get involved with.
For Kathleen, that wound up being a return to her religious roots.
She and my dad started attending the church that my wife and I go to in Stockton, which is it's an evangelical covenant church.
I got to know Katie as a member of the church. She was quiet, but she was passionate when you were able to sit and talk with her about things that really pulled at her heart.
At the church, Kathleen became an avid volunteer.
My mom loved doing things for other people and helping people.
And she soon found her calling.
She became a part of our Advocates for Victims of Abuse program that we have. What that group does is it ministers to women from, it could be sexual violence, and it could be home or spousal abuse.
She was good at it too.
She would say, "This is for me to do," and then she would learn aggressively, almost obsessively about it because it wasn't okay to go halfway.
She would at times ask me to pray for her as she was reaching out to women or children involved in abuse.
But on Halloween of 2011, it would be Kathleen's children who needed prayers, and she would be the victim. That October, Kathleen's husband, Tom, is away as usual.
Tom was, I believe, in Japan or China on a business trip.
But despite that, the house is more crowded than it's been in years.
Caitlin was actually home. She was preparing to get married and preparing to move.
Caitlin's older brother, Dawson, is also living at home, at least for the time being.
He graduated from University of the Pacific. He was a music major and was very talented musically, and he was teaching music to elementary school students.
And Kathleen still has her volunteer commitments to keep up with, which has her scrambling in the kitchen on Sunday afternoon, October 30th.
She was making jambalaya for the domestic violence class the next day. They're having a potluck.
But at a little before 5, the pot is off the stove and in the refrigerator, ready for the next day. And Kathleen quickly cleans up the kitchen because she has one last chore to do before the day is done: pick up her daughter, Caitlin, who'd spent the weekend at a Christian ministry retreat.
She left on a Friday and was coming back on a Sunday evening.
So after washing the dishes and wiping down the counter, Kathleen dashes back to her bedroom to grab the keys off her dresser.
She was planning on picking Caitlin up at 6 o'clock.
But as she turns to leave, Kathleen freezes in terror. Because looming in the doorway, blocking her only escape, is a knife-wielding killer in a Halloween mask. Coming up, the horrific murder strikes terror in the community.
She had a constellation of stab wounds consistent with what we have traditionally called an overkill.
But why had the mother of four been so brutally attacked?
The house is neat, orderly. There was no signs of any forced entry to the house.
At dusk on Halloween 2011, the streets of Manteca, California were alive with groups of children eagerly going door to door. But in one Manteca neighborhood, the trick-or-treaters were stopped in their tracks when police sirens descended on the suburban home of Tom and Kathleen McGehee. Minutes earlier, firefighters and EMTs had responded to a 911 call from the couple's daughter, Caitlin.
The call was just that they were concerned about mom. She wasn't responding at the door and she had some health concerns.
But when the first responders broke down Kathleen's locked bedroom door, they stepped into a scene straight out of a horror movie. The 55-year-old mother of four lay sprawled on the floor, dead.
There had been multiple stab wounds to the upper torso.
At the precise moment that thousands of children were out roaming the streets, the Manteca police had a murder on their hands.
There's not too many things that surprise you after you've been doing the job for a while, but every once in a while something like this comes along.
Across town, Detective Wayne Miller and his children were heading out the door for a night of trick-or-treating.
I get a call from dispatch advising me of a homicide.
And when he arrived at the scene, Detective Miller immediately realized that Halloween wasn't the only thing that made this murder unusual.
The house was in a upper middle class neighborhood, not a place that we typically would expect this kind of a call.
The nature of the crime stood out too.
This was a very violent death.
She had sustained multiple stab wounds, a constellation of stab wounds that would be consistent with what we have traditionally called an overkill.
It appeared that the killer had surprised Kathleen as she was on her way out.
At the time that we found her, her car keys were next to her hand.
The blunt force trauma indicated that she was beaten up, knocked down, while she was fighting to the best of her ability.
And once she fell, her attacker had been relentless, enraged even.
He did not stab her just once. He stayed with her and stabbed her multiple times. Not once, not twice, not 3 times. 10 times.
But who would commit such a horrible crime?
I'd never considered that Katie would have someone who would wish her ill will.
It didn't appear to be a burglary gone wrong.
The house is neat, orderly. There was no signs of any forced entry to the house, valuables throughout the house that hadn't been disturbed.
In fact, other than Kathleen's dead body, the killer had left no trace behind.
We never found a bloody knife anywhere. So we believe it was a kitchen knife.
The wounds tell us that the knife was a single-edged knife.
But who had wielded it? Hoping for some answers, or at least a better sense of the timeline leading up to the murder, the investigators turned to Kathleen's daughter.
I brought Caitlin McGehee back to the police department to interview her.
At the police station, Caitlin told Detective Miller that she'd been living at home for the past few weeks.
My sister was getting married soon, and she had come into town to stay with my parents, do some shopping, find a wedding dress, plan things out.
Although, according to Caitlin, she was away when her mother was killed.
She's been gone for the weekend to a Christian retreat. She left on Friday and was supposed to be coming back on Sunday, and she made arrangements with her mom to pick her up on Sunday when she got back.
Caitlin had called the home phone and left a message for her mom saying, hey, pick me up at 6 o'clock.
But at 6, when Caitlin got back from the retreat, her mother wasn't waiting.
When Caitlin tried to call Kathleen didn't answer the house phone. She didn't answer her cell phone.
However, after trying to reach Kathleen several times, Caitlin finally did get a call back. Only it wasn't her mother. It was Caitlin's older brother, Dawson.
Dawson called and said, "Oh yeah, I remember Mom said something about you needing to get picked up, and why don't I just pick you up because I got some errands to run anyway."
Glad she wasn't left stranded, Caitlin accompanied her brother on his errands, and then the pair stopped off for dinner.
They didn't arrive back home until almost 11 o'clock at night.
By then, her mother had gone to bed. At least, that's what Caitlin's brother said.
Dawson told her that their mom was not feeling well.
At the time, Caitlin hadn't thought much of it.
She simply just goes and goes to bed herself in her bedroom.
The next morning, when her mother didn't stir, Caitlin figured that her mother was still sleeping in, something her brother later confirmed.
At 6:30, he sends her a text saying, "Hey, I talked to Mom earlier this morning. She's not feeling well. She's going to sleep the rest of the afternoon."
According to Caitlin, she and Dawson had spent the morning out.
Dawson said that Kathleen had asked Dawson to drive Caitlin to do some errands such as closing her bank account.
Then, she'd met a friend for lunch.
When she got home, she didn't see Dawson, and then she went to go check on her mom.
Caitlin had called 911, and then her brother, Justin, who'd rushed right over.
When I got there and I saw police lights and ambulance lines flashing.
Caitlin had also tried calling Dawson.
She was actually outside with law enforcement trying to call him to let him know. And Dawson was not answering his phone. Caitlin was not able to get in touch with him.
Did that mean he wasn't aware of the horror that awaited behind his mother's locked door?
Where was he at when this apparently happened? We knew that she had been deceased for at least a few hours. Rigor mortis has set in.
Or had she been dead even longer? Kathleen's phone records indicated that her last call had been made on Sunday afternoon to Dawson's older brother, Colin, while she was working in the kitchen.
She talked to her son on the phone right around 4 o'clock. So we know that she's alive and well at 4 o'clock. We know she's not answering her phone at 5 o'clock. And no one other than Dawson can say that they saw her or spoke to her after that time.
And that left the investigators convinced that Dawson was the key to solving his mother's mysterious murder.
And so the focus did become, where is Dawson? Why is he not answering? Why can we not get a hold of him?
Coming up, the investigators make a chilling discovery in Dawson's bedroom.
There was a journal that was discovered that gave a lot of insight into his mind.
And the portrait of a troubled young man emerges.
Some switch went off inside of his head.
On Halloween night 2011, the police in Manteca, California, had a nightmare on their hands. On the one night a year that saw thousands of children going door to door, a murder suspect was roaming the streets. At around 6 that evening, just as kids were donning costumes and homeowners were busy prepping the candy, firefighters and EMTs responding to a welfare check had found 55-year-old Kathleen McGehee murdered in her bedroom.
They found Kathleen and noticed the stab wounds and called for police response.
And now, just hours after finding Kathleen dead, the investigators believed that Kathleen's son, 26-year-old Dawson McGehee, held crucial information that could crack the case.
The only other person who lived at the house was Dawson, and Kathleen had been home alone with Dawson all weekend.
But did the fact that he was apparently the last person to see her alive mean that Dawson had something to do with his mother's death? Dawson McGehee was born in 1985.
In the sibling lineup, Dawson was third born. So I had me, then my brother Colin, then him, and then my sister Caitlin.
Although compared to his siblings, he'd been a handful.
He always required so much more attention than the other children.
And it didn't matter if the attention was positive or negative.
He would get into all these little ways of trying to get someone to react. He would try to get a rise out of me, try to get a rise out of our other brother, out of my sister. You know, he would do little things until she cried.
And according to Justin, Dawson was eventually diagnosed with ADHD.
He needed more time being guided through his homework or his daily work. Mom really wrestled with whether to have him on. I think like almost all they had at the time was Ritalin.
But instead of medication, Dawson found music.
Dawson really could connect with that emotionally. There's a lot in that you almost can't put into words. And so he would just spend hours practicing.
The focus seemed to help. Dawson finished high school and went on to college, graduating in 2009 with a music degree.
He graduated from University of the Pacific here in Stockton, and with over a 3.0 GPA.
Although he graduated, he never really got off the ground. He never really got that job and moved out of the home and began to live an adult life.
He briefly taught music part-time at a local elementary school, but the job didn't last.
It was difficult for young adults coming out of college to obtain employment in their field.
However, that wasn't the only or even the biggest issue that Dawson faced. There was something else, too, something that set him apart from the typical underemployed millennial.
Some switch went off inside of his head, and he did believe he was either possessed with or seeing demons.
Worried for her son, Kathleen had sought help.
His mother had been taking him to various psychologists and psychiatrists in the area.
A lot of her attention was spent towards just trying to figure out what was going on with him.
Despite the therapy, Dawson's situation continued to deteriorate.
He became more and more withdrawn and wasn't working. He also started using marijuana a lot. People, that are starting to suffer from mental illness will self-medicate.
However, Dawson's self-medication had only made things worse.
When he smoked pot, it enhanced his visions or his thoughts of the religious angels and demons scenarios.
And as his dreams and visions grew more frequent and vivid, Dawson developed a fascination with horror and slasher films. The gorier, the better. The fascination soon became an obsession, to the point that he began collecting props, costumes, and masks from his favorite films.
We found in his bedroom multiple masks, like hockey-style masks like Jason would wear in the Friday the 13th movies, coveralls like Michael Myers wore in the Halloween movies.
He'd wear them around the house, the masks and capes and that kind of stuff.
He would even wear them in public.
He would wear them while he was driving sometimes. He said that they calmed him.
He really liked Halloween, and he wanted to go see it at the movie theater. And one of his brothers had taken him, and he had brought with him the Jason mask, and he was actually wearing the mask.
And such bizarre public behavior wasn't the only evidence of Dawson's deteriorating mental state.
There was a journal that was discovered that gave a lot of insight into his mind and the way he was thinking.
There were some very unusual religious sort of connotations, phrases, just statements by him that had religious undertones.
His whole family is very religious, but he became obsessed with religion and felt like he was seeing Jesus.
It's hard to say if this religious infatuation had been manifesting for a long period of time or shortly before the murder happened. But he seemed to be really obsessed with that.
Or was it possible, Dawson's siblings began to wonder, that his obsession with angels, demons, and horror films was just Dawson's latest attempt to grab attention?
He seems to be using this to carve out a life for himself where he just gets to be the pathetic, pitiful, unstable, unhealthy, whatever person that'll just be loved and nurtured and taken care of. It's almost like he had this idea that the right kind of relationship to have is one in which you don't have to do anything and everybody does stuff for you.
Kathleen certainly did everything she could to make Dawson happy.
Dawson was very dependent on his mom, wanted his mom, I think, to rescue him or always needed attention from his mom.
She was doing his laundry. He didn't cook the food. He would leave messes around the house for my mom or both my parents to clean up. He wasn't pulling his weight at all, even in little ways.
But did that mean Dawson was deliberately taking advantage of his mother? Whenever her children suggested it, Kathleen became defensive.
It didn't feel as much like she received it as us being a team with her and trying to do what was best for him, but as though we were all against him and against what she was doing, and so therefore against her too.
She was really his one and only ally. There was a rift between, I think, the rest of the family and Katie. And I know that the husband, Tom, was very frustrated with Katie's constant excuses for Dawson.
Although as time went on, others shared the rest of the family's frustration, including Kathleen's pastor.
I think Dawson took advantage of Katie's compassionate and empathetic heart and played to being wounded so that Katie would go out of her way to help him.
And thanks to her involvement in the church, especially her volunteer work as an advocate for victims of domestic violence, Kathleen slowly came around too.
In the course of those classes, teaches you to recognize signs of somebody that might be codependent or enabling.
She was starting to realize how she was being manipulated by Dawson.
As a result, Kathleen's relationship with Dawson had started to change.
She was standing up to Dawson more, starting to question some of Dawson's behaviors.
And over the course of 2011, she had begun distancing herself from Dawson, making a conscious effort not to cater to his every need.
Her attention was on other things and wasn't just on Dawson.
Not just her volunteer work either. There was also Caitlin's upcoming wedding.
Kathleen has been spending a lot of time with her, planning this wedding.
Kathleen's new priorities didn't sit well with Dawson.
He may have felt some sort of abandonment from her.
His mom was always his ally. His mom was the one that was going to help him, and there always had to be attention from mom.
But had Dawson's sense of abandonment festered into a murderous rage?
When Mom began to say, no, we can't do all the things you want to do all the time, somehow he just could not deal with that. He felt like the world was coming unhinged, and he certainly was.
That's what the evidence and family history appeared to suggest. Even if Dawson's brother had a hard time bringing himself to believe it.
I can't think of a single time when I saw or knew of him physically hurting someone. We'd stir up conflict, but never get physical. I was never afraid of my own kids being around him. Never in a million years expected that he would suddenly go from being dependent and manipulative to suddenly violent.
And not just violent. What Dawson had allegedly done bordered on the unthinkable.
It's a son accused of a very horrific crime against his own mother.
And now, on Halloween night, the disturbed and potentially deadly young man was somewhere out there. And thousands of vulnerable children were out on the streets, happily trick-or-treating and totally unaware that a murderer in a mask might be among them. Coming up, with a madman on the loose, the police launch a desperate manhunt.
13 years as a police officer, I can't recall ever working an investigation like that.
And with the streets packed with children, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Both hands up in the air!
In Manteca, California, Halloween night 2011 had all the makings of a horror movie. That evening, just as trick-or-treating was about to start, firefighters and EMTs responding to a welfare check had found Kathleen McGehee, a 55-year-old mother of 4, murdered in her own home.
She was very clearly, deliberately killed by somebody. It's very obvious. There's no way this was an accident.
And Kathleen's son, Justin, was convinced that his deeply troubled brother, 26-year-old Dawson McGehee, had something to do with their mother's murder.
It's gotta be Dawson. I don't know that, but I can't see how this could have happened any other way.
And if Justin was right, that meant his brother could be out prowling Manteca's streets, which were packed with hundreds of potential victims.
No one knew where he was at the time. I put out a BOL, be on the lookout, to our officers.
And at a little after midnight, a patrol officer finally spotted Dawson's car and started tailing it.
He was waiting for additional units to effect a traffic stop.
Units raced to the scene from all across town.
I got there just before they stopped the vehicle. We conducted what's called a high-risk vehicle stop.
Dawson! Stick your hands out the window, both hands up in the air!
He followed all the instructions. He didn't ask any questions.
Hands up! Face the front of the car! Stop!
He just did what he was instructed to do, and was handcuffed and placed in a patrol vehicle.
With Dawson in custody, the tense search was finally over.
Being on Halloween, it was just very bizarre, like a movie.
And things got even stranger when the investigators brought Dawson in for questioning.
He would suddenly start fidgeting and having some jerking body movements and doing weird things with his hands.
Almost like he had Parkinson's disease.
Despite the shaking, Dawson did manage to deny having anything to do with his mother's death.
I want to talk to you about what happened to your mom. What happened to my mom? Well, you tell me. People called me and said something happened at home to Mom. They were very bad. Mm-hmm. What happened to my mom?
He just said that he got some phone messages from his brother that something happened to Mom and he needed to come home.
That's what Dawson claimed, but the investigators soon noticed something that contradicted his denials.
When I had the patrol officer bring him back to the police department, I had him collect the clothing that he was wearing and a black leather jacket. There were some stains on that black leather jacket that appeared that they may be blood. And when I started asking more questions, he asked if he should have a lawyer.
You're supposed to have an attorney. Come on, let's do it. I would offer that. I want to ask for an attorney. You want to ask for an attorney? Yeah.
At that point, I have to respect his rights, and I stopped with any questioning.
Between the apparent bloodstain, what he'd told his sister about their mother sleeping in, and the fact that he'd been home alone with Kathleen at roughly the time she had been killed, the police placed Dawson under arrest for murder. And by the time he stood trial for murder on November 6, 2012, the evidence against Dawson looked even stronger.
The clothing items were sent to the Department of Justice for analysis, and it was determined that there was blood on the sleeve of his black leather jacket, and it matched up to belong to his mother.
And according to the prosecutor's opening statement, that could only mean one thing, that Dawson was guilty of murder.
There was no reasonable explanation for his mother's blood to be on his jacket.
Then, after laying out the forensic evidence that implicated Dawson for the murder, the prosecutor detailed how he'd killed his mother with cold and calculated precision.
Caitlin was going to be out of town. He knew it was going to be Halloween. He knew his father was out of town. In my mind, I believe that he planned it. That he wanted to provoke a fight, that he wanted to do this, that he had planned it for some time.
13 years as a police officer, I can't recall ever working an investigation where an adult son came in and brutally murdered their mother.
However, as damning as the blood and Dawson's infatuation with violent horror movies were, would they be enough to secure a conviction?
We entered the plea of not guilty by reason of insanity.
The legal insanity in California is that you either don't understand the nature and consequences of your actions, or you don't know what you're doing is wrong.
The prosecutors were confident they could prove Dawson had known what he was doing.
Lying about his mother, saying, "Oh, I'm not feeling good, I'm going to sleep the rest of the day." Those are clearly signs of consciousness of guilt.
But first, The jury would have to decide whether he had actually killed his mother.
Mental deficiency or illness doesn't come in to the guilt phase.
Then if found guilty, then he would go into a second trial to determine whether he was sane or insane at the time.
During the guilt phase, the defense did its best to attack the prosecution's case.
They didn't have the murder weapon. They didn't have anything like that. They didn't have a confession, anything along those lines.
Still, the prosecutors had no doubt that the jurors would determine that Dawson was his mother's killer.
There was no other reasonable interpretation that we could make of the evidence and his conduct.
But despite the prosecutor's confidence, when it was the jury's turn to interpret the evidence, they struggled with the decision.
They took days and days to deliberate that. Days and days.
Miss Adams had been pushing for a first-degree homicide, and I thought maybe one or two jurors would find that they didn't have enough evidence.
But if there were one or two holdouts hesitant to find for first-degree murder, could they make a difference? On November 29th, after a week of deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict.
They found him guilty of second-degree murder.
I had hoped for first degree, but it's still more understandable for someone to do something in a rage than someone planning this all out. And there's a charitable benefit of the doubt in that.
I think it's too difficult for a jury of 12 people to think that a family member would really take the time to plan and deliberate and premeditate to do this type of a gruesome killing.
The jury's work wasn't done, however.
After they found him guilty, we start the insanity phase.
If found not guilty by reason of insanity, he would be sent to a state hospital rather than a prison.
And if the jury decided to send Dawson to prison, he could be there for a very long time.
15 years to life is what the sentence is for a second-degree murder.
But which way would the jury rule? At trial, Dawson exhibited none of the bizarre symptoms that had been on display during his interrogation.
He had dropped the twitching and movements, and he basically just sat there stone-faced throughout the trial.
Even during the autopsy photos and the photos of the crime scene, he was very emotionless.
But did Dawson's detached behavior argue for or against his sanity? Opinions differed, even among the experts.
We put the doctors on that actually interviewed him. I had two doctors that both determined he was sane, and the defense had one court-appointed doctor who indicated that he was insane at the time, and then they hired a doctor that came back and said he was insane.
Those four doctors weren't the only ones who testified, though. There was also a fifth doctor, one whose opinion could very well decide whether Dawson went to prison or a psychiatric hospital.
I was appointed not for the prosecution or for the defense, but to do an impartial evaluation for the court. They needed another opinion to essentially break the tie.
Coming up, the doctor testifies about his examination of Dawson.
He was hearing voices that morning.
But will his testimony end the debate over Dawson's sanity?
The jury took a matter of minutes.
December of 2012, Dawson McGehee had already been convicted of murdering his mother on the day before Halloween 2011. But now it was up to the jury to decide whether the 27-year-old would be sentenced to prison or a state psychiatric hospital.
Dawson's defense was an insanity defense. The argument was that he was not capable of knowing or understanding the nature of the act.
The police and prosecutors had argued strenuously against the insanity defense.
We felt that even if he did have some sort of mental issues, he still knew that what he did was wrong.
And Dawson's family went even further than that.
He was faking it. He had a lot of time to build up this whole I'm mentally unstable, oh, I killed my mom because I'm crazy thing.
Dawson's own father described his son as a predator. He described him as someone who lied a lot, someone who was manipulative.
The expert opinion was divided, though. During the insanity phase, 2 psychiatrists had testified that Dawson was sane, while 2 others testified that he wasn't, which meant that the entire outcome could be riding on the testimony of Dr. Philip Trompeter, the 5th doctor who examined Dawson.
During my interview with Mr. McGehee, he was essentially focusing a great deal on all of these symptoms that he said he had, including hearing voices that morning. He expressed a number of peculiar ideas, which is sometimes seen with mentally ill people.
There was one catch, however.
Most often, mentally ill people don't parade their symptoms in front of you.
And that led Dr. Trompeter to an inescapable conclusion.
In my opinion, he was faking.
But would the jury agree with the doctor's diagnosis?
The jury took a matter of minutes to find him sane.
Dawson McGehee would be going to prison.
He was sentenced to 16 years to life.
15 years to life is what the sentence is for second-degree murder, and then he was given an enhancement based on the use of the knife.
However, while Dawson was found to be sane and sent to prison, one question remains. How did Halloween factor into his mother's murder? Was it the trigger?
It was obvious that he used Halloween as his launching pad, as his moment to seize and act out on some of the fantasies that were going on inside of his head.
Or, as his brother believes, was it part of Dawson's plan to both murder his mother and hopefully get away with it?
I thought it was calculated. You hear about killing your mother, people think, oh, well, there must be something wrong with him. And then they're more likely to go, oh, no one would do that.
Without a confession,
I dropped a gun. Why didn't you just say that?
someone will get away with murder.
On the morning of August 5th, 2012, the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin in Oak Creek was a place where people had come for something ordinary and deeply familiar: prayer, community, and the shared routines of a Sunday gathering. The Gurdwara stood on South Howell Avenue, outside Milwaukee, and that morning members of the Sikh community were preparing for religious activities and the communal meal known as langar. Nothing about the morning suggested that, within a short time, the building would become the scene of one of the deadliest attacks on a house of worship in modern American history. It was a Sunday morning, and for the people inside, there was no reason to believe that anything was about to change. Then Wade Michael Page arrived. Sometime between approximately 10:25 and 10:45 in the morning, Page appeared at the temple carrying a 9mm handgun. He was 40 years old, a former member of the United States military, and a man whose life had become increasingly connected to white supremacist and white power circles. He had been involved with bands associated with that movement, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. Years earlier, he had served in the military and received training in psychological operations. But his military career had eventually ended after he was demoted and discharged. By the time he arrived at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, Page was no longer simply a former soldier. He had become connected to an ideological environment built around racial hatred, white supremacy, and extremism. Yet the people inside the temple had no reason to know any of that. To them, he was not the subject of an FBI investigation, not a name that would later appear in national headlines, and not the man whose background would become the focus of a federal investigation into domestic extremism. He was simply a stranger who had arrived at a place of worship. Then he began shooting. The first moments of the attack were marked by confusion. People who had been preparing for a religious gathering suddenly found themselves confronted with violence. A place intended for prayer and community became a crime scene within moments. Page fired at people in the area outside the temple before continuing toward the Gurdwara. What had been an ordinary Sunday was transformed into panic and terror. The attack would ultimately claim the lives of 6 Sikh worshippers: Paramjit Kaur, 41, Prakash Singh, 39, Sita Singh, 41, Ranjit Singh, 49, Satwant Singh Kalika, 65, and Suvik Singh, 84. Their names would become part of the permanent record of the tragedy. But they were more than names on a casualty list. They were members of a community that had gathered together on a Sunday morning in a place that was supposed to provide safety, faith, and connection. Among them was Satwant Singh Kalika, 65, a significant figure within the temple community who had served in a leadership role. Another was Suvik Singh, 84, an elderly member of the community whose presence in the temple that morning reflected the ordinary rhythm of communal religious life. The ages of the victims alone reveal the breadth of the tragedy. The youngest among those killed was 39. The oldest was 84. There was a woman in her 40s, men in their 30s, 40s, and 60s, and an elderly man. They were not gathered for a confrontation. They were not participating in a political demonstration or an armed dispute. They were inside a Gurdwara, and that fact would become central to the questions that followed. Why this place? Why these people? And why had Wade Michael Page chosen a Sikh temple as the setting for his attack? In the immediate aftermath, those questions could not be answered. Page would never stand in a courtroom and explain himself. He would never sit across from investigators and describe what had brought him there. He would never provide a final statement revealing exactly what he believed he was doing or why he had selected the Sikh community. Instead, the answers would have to be sought through the evidence left behind: his background, his connections, his history, his weapons, and the ideological world in which he had spent years. The investigation would eventually focus heavily on his links to white supremacist and white power circles. But even that evidence would have limits. It could establish a disturbing ideological background. It could show that Page had associated with people and organizations connected to white supremacy. It could provide investigators with a possible explanation for why a minority religious community had been targeted. But it could not provide every answer. The FBI would ultimately conclude that Page acted alone. Investigators found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had directed the attack or provided him with direct assistance. There was no larger conspiracy that could be presented as the explanation for what happened that morning. There was Wade Michael Page, his history, his beliefs, his weapon, and the people he chose to attack. The final moments of the gunman's life would also become part of the mystery. When Lieutenant Brian Murphy, one of the first police officers to arrive, confronted Page outside the temple, Page opened fire on him. Murphy was struck multiple times, but survived. Another officer then confronted Page and shot him. At first, reports suggested that Page had been killed by police. Later, the FBI established that this was not what happened. After being wounded and disabled, Page placed the handgun against his own head and fired. The fatal wound was self-inflicted. He died at the scene. That meant there would be no interrogation, no confession, and no criminal trial for the man responsible for the attack. There would be no moment in court when the families of the victims could hear Page explain what he had done. The investigation would have to speak for him. The 6 people killed that morning would never have the chance to return to their families. 4 others were wounded, including Lieutenant Brian Murphy. Another victim, Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee, suffered a devastating head injury and would live for years with severe disabilities before dying in 2020. His later death was determined to be a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered in the 2012 shooting. In that sense, the consequences of August 5th did not end when the gunman died at the scene. They continued through the lives of the survivors, the families of the victims, the police officers who responded, and the wider Sikh community. The tragedy also forced the United States to confront difficult questions about extremist ideology and violence against religious minorities. It raised questions about radicalization, white supremacist movements, access to firearms, and the challenge of identifying individuals who may move from extremist beliefs to violent action. But before any of those questions could be debated, before the FBI could reconstruct the attack and investigate Page's background, there was simply the morning itself. A community had gathered. People were preparing for worship and a communal meal. The day had begun with familiar routines. Then a man carrying a handgun entered their world, and 6 people lost their lives. The story of the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin is therefore not only the story of Wade Michael Page. It is the story of the people who were inside that temple, the community they belonged to, and the unanswered questions that remained after the gunman was gone. To understand the tragedy, we have to begin not with the ideology of the attacker, but with the people whose ordinary Sunday morning was suddenly taken from them. Before Wade Michael Page entered the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin, the building was not a crime scene. It was a place of worship, community, and routine. On Sunday morning, August 5, 2012, members of the Sikh community in Oak Creek had gathered for religious activities and for langar, the communal meal that is an important part of Sikh community life. The Gurdwara on South Howell Avenue was a place where people came together, and that morning was supposed to follow the familiar rhythm of a Sunday gathering. The people inside were not expecting violence. They were not preparing for an attack. They were participating in the ordinary life of their community. That ordinary beginning is important because the victims of the shooting are sometimes reduced, in the retelling of a mass casualty event, to numbers. 6 people killed, 4 people wounded, 7 dead at the scene if the gunman is included. But behind those numbers were 6 individuals with names, ages, and places within a community. Their identities mattered long before August 5, 2012, and they remained important after the shooting. The first victim was Paramjit Kaur, 41 years old. She was among the 6 Sikh worshippers killed during the attack. The available information about her in this account is limited, and that limitation matters. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to fill gaps with imagined memories, conversations, family scenes, or details that have not been established. But there is no need to invent a life in order to recognize its value. Paramjit Kaur was 41, and on that Sunday morning she was at the Sikh temple as part of her community. That is what can be established here. The second victim was Prakash Singh, 39. Like the other members of the Sikh community who were killed, he had come to a place intended for worship and community. His death became part of the terrible sequence of events that unfolded after Page opened fire. The third victim was Sita Singh, 41. Her name stands alongside the others in the record of the attack, a reminder that the violence did not strike an abstract crowd. It struck individual people. The fourth victim was Ranjit Singh, 49. His death, like those of the others, was the result of an attack that had no connection to any conflict occurring inside the temple that morning. The victims had not gathered for confrontation. They had gathered for religious and community activities. Then there was Satwant Singh Kalika, 65 years old, a significant figure within the Sikh temple community who had served in a leadership role. His presence gives another dimension to the tragedy. The attack did not simply take 6 lives. It also removed people who occupied places within a community and whose absence would be felt long after the shooting ended. Kalika was 65. By the time Page arrived at the temple, Kalika had already spent years as part of the community. He was one of the people who represented the temple and helped give it a sense of continuity. When violence entered that space, that continuity was shattered. The 6th victim was Suvig Singh, 84. His age alone makes the violence difficult to comprehend. He was the oldest of the 6 people killed. 84 years of life had preceded that Sunday morning, and yet the final hours of his life became part of a national tragedy. The names of the victims would later be repeated in reports about the shooting, but the circumstances of their deaths were inseparable from the setting in which they had been living their ordinary lives. They were Sikh worshippers inside a Gurdwara. For the people who knew them, their identities were not defined by the manner of their deaths. They were members of a community. The attack also injured 4 people, including Lieutenant Brian Murphy, the police officer who confronted Page. Another injured worshiper was Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee. His story demonstrates that the consequences of the shooting extended far beyond the morning itself. Punjab Singh suffered a severe head injury and survived, but he remained seriously disabled for years. His life after the attack was shaped by injuries that had occurred inside the temple in 2012. He eventually died in 2020, and his death was determined to be a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered during the shooting. His story means that even the final count of victims cannot be understood simply by looking at what happened during the first minutes of the attack. Some consequences continued for years. For the Sikh community in Oak Creek, the temple itself also carried meaning beyond the physical structure. A Gurdwara is a place where people gather for worship and community. The communal meal, langar, represents the shared life of the community. That morning, people were preparing for those activities when the attack began. The contrast between what the temple represented and what happened there would become one of the defining elements of the tragedy. A place associated with prayer became the setting for murder. A gathering intended to bring people together was interrupted by a man carrying a handgun. And the people who were killed were not random figures in a distant story. They belonged to a community that had gathered together. The identities of the victims also help explain why the attack reverberated beyond Oak Creek. The victims represented different ages and different roles within the community. Paramjit Kaur was 41. Prakash Singh was 39. Sita Singh was 41. Ranjit Singh was 49. Satwant Singh Kalika was 65. Suvig Singh was 84. Their ages stretched across several generations. The attack, therefore, did not affect one narrow group within the temple. It took the lives of people at different stages of life. Yet the available information does not allow us to reconstruct their private thoughts that morning. We cannot know what each person was thinking in the minutes before the shooting. We cannot invent conversations they may have had or emotions they may have felt. What we can say is that they were present in a place of worship during a community gathering when the violence began. That fact is enough to establish the profound randomness and cruelty of the attack. The tragedy also carried a larger significance because the Sikh community in America had already faced the problem of being misunderstood by people unfamiliar with Sikh identity. The history of the attacker would later make that issue particularly important. Wade Michael Page had been involved in white power and white supremacist circles, including bands associated with that ideology. Investigators would examine whether his extremist beliefs provided the motivation for choosing the Sikh temple. But at the beginning of the story, none of that was visible to the people inside. They were simply members of a religious community going about their Sunday morning. That is why the victim should remain at the center of this story. Page would later become the name most frequently associated with the case. His photograph, his military background, his connections to white supremacist circles, and the questions surrounding his motives would occupy investigators and the media. But the attack was not ultimately about the importance of the man who carried the gun. It was about the people whose lives were taken. 6 people entered the history of August 5, 2012, as victims of an act of extremist violence. 4 others survived with injuries. One of those survivors, Baba Punjab Singh, would carry the consequences for years. And the community itself would have to confront the fact that violence had entered a place designed for worship and fellowship. By the time the morning was over, the familiar rhythm of the Gurdwara had been broken. The preparations for religious activities and langar had been replaced by emergency response, injuries, death, and investigation. Yet the identities of the people who had gathered there remained unchanged. They were still members of the Sikh community. They were still parents, relatives, friends, elders, and community members. Even if the limited information available here does not allow every relationship to be described, their lives did not begin on the morning of August 5th, and their story should not end with the moment they were killed. What happened inside the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin would eventually become a case about extremism, domestic terrorism, firearms, and the investigation of a lone attacker. But before it became any of those things, it was a tragedy experienced by a community in one of the most intimate spaces imaginable. A place where people had gathered to pray, eat together, and be among their own. On that Sunday morning, 6 of them would never leave the temple alive. Their names were Paranjit Kaur, Prakash Singh, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Satwant Singh Kalika, and Suvik Singh. Remembering those names is more important than remembering the spectacle of the crime. Because behind every investigation, every statistic, and every question about motive is the same simple fact. These were people who had come to their place of worship expecting an ordinary Sunday, and their lives were taken from them there. The morning of August 5th, 2012, had begun with the familiar rhythm of a Sunday at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. Members of the community were gathering at the Gurdwara on South Howell Avenue in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, preparing for religious activities and the communal meal known as langar. It was a setting defined by worship and community rather than confrontation. People had come together as they normally would, sharing the same space and participating in the ordinary routines of their religious life. There was nothing in that morning, at least from the perspective of those inside the temple, that suggested they were about to become the victims of a mass shooting. Sometime between approximately 10:25 and 10:45 a.m., Wade Michael Page appeared in the area of the temple carrying a 9mm handgun. He was 40 years old. He was also a man whose background would later become central to the investigation. A former member of the United States military who had become involved with white power and white supremacist circles. But in the moments before the shooting began, none of those details would have been visible to the people inside. Page was simply a man who had arrived at their place of worship. Then he opened fire. The transition from an ordinary gathering to a violent attack happened quickly. People who had been engaged in the activities of the temple were suddenly confronted with gunfire. At first, there was confusion. The people present did not immediately understand what was happening. A place that had been associated with prayer and community suddenly became a scene of fear and violence. Page fired at people in the area outside the temple before continuing toward the Gurdwara. The attack was not directed at someone with whom he had been involved in a personal dispute. There was no confrontation described in the available account that preceded the shooting. Instead, Page entered a religious community space and began attacking the people there. That distinction would become important later, because investigators would have to determine not only what Page had done, but why he had chosen this particular location and these particular victims. Inside the temple, the situation was rapidly becoming catastrophic. 6 Sikh worshippers would ultimately be killed. They were Paranjit Kaur, 41, Prakash Singh, 39, Sita Singh, 41, Ranjit Singh, 49, Satwant Singh Kalika, 65, and Suvik Singh, 84. Their names would later be repeated in official accounts and news reports. But during the attack, they were not statistics. They were individual people caught in a sudden act of violence. The ages of the victims show how broadly the attack affected the community. The youngest among those killed was 39, while the oldest was 84. There was no single age group that could be separated from the violence. The shooting reached across generations. Satwant Singh Kalika was particularly significant within the temple community because he had served in a leadership role. His death therefore represented not only the loss of an individual, but also the loss of someone who had held an important place within the community. Suvik Singh, at 84, represented another generation entirely. Yet all 6 victims shared the same basic circumstance that morning. They were Sikh worshippers gathered at their temple. As Page continued the attack, the response outside the temple was already beginning. Emergency calls brought law enforcement toward the scene. Among the first officers to arrive was Lieutenant Brian Murphy of the Oak Creek Police Department. Murphy moved toward the area where Page was located. The encounter between the officer and the gunman would become one of the most consequential moments of the entire incident. Page opened fire on Murphy. The lieutenant was struck multiple times and seriously wounded, but he survived. The fact that Murphy was able to survive the encounter would later become an important part of the story of the attack. But at that moment, there was no certainty that he would live. He had arrived as a police officer responding to a report of violence and had immediately become one of its victims. Another officer then confronted Page. The second officer fired and struck the gunman. Page was wounded and disabled. At first, the circumstances of Page's death were reported differently. Initial accounts suggested that police gunfire had killed him. That understanding was later corrected after the FBI examined the evidence. Page had not died from the officer's gunfire. Instead, after being wounded, he placed the handgun against his own head and fired. The fatal wound was self-inflicted. Wade Michael Page died at the scene. His death changed the nature of the investigation that would follow. There would be no possibility of arresting him, questioning him, or bringing him before a court. There would be no opportunity for investigators to ask him directly why he had chosen the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. There would be no confession and no courtroom testimony from the gunman. The answers would have to be reconstructed from evidence and from what investigators could establish about his background and activities. By the time the shooting had ended, 6 Sikh worshippers had been killed. 4 people had been wounded, including Lieutenant Murphy. Page himself was dead. The immediate death toll was therefore 7 if the gunman was included, although the 6 murdered worshippers remained at the center of the tragedy. The number of victims would not fully capture what had happened. One of the wounded, Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee, suffered a severe head injury. He survived the initial attack, but was left with serious disabilities. His injuries would remain part of the consequences of the shooting for years. And when he died in 2020, his death was determined to be a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered during the attack. The incident, therefore, did not have a single moment of conclusion when Page died. For the victims' families, the survivors, and the community, the consequences continued long after the gunman was gone. But in the immediate aftermath, investigators faced the task of understanding what had happened inside and around the temple. They needed to establish the sequence of events, determine where the victims had been, examine the weapon, and reconstruct Page's movements. They also needed to understand whether he had acted alone. That question would become one of the central concerns of the FBI investigation. Page had a documented connection to an extremist ideological environment. He had participated in bands associated with white supremacy, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. His background raised the possibility that the shooting could have been connected to a larger white supremacist organization or network. Investigators, therefore, had to look beyond the immediate crime scene. They examined his relationships, his history, his military background, his activities, and his connections to extremist circles. The possibility of a wider conspiracy could not simply be assumed, even if Page's ideology provided an obvious area of concern. It had to be investigated, and the fact that Page was dead made that task more difficult. The gunman could not explain himself. Every conclusion would have to be supported by evidence. The attack also raised a deeper question. Why would someone associated with white supremacist ideology choose a Sikh Gurdwara? The available information does not provide a definitive statement from Page explaining his target. His death ensured that his exact thinking would remain inaccessible. Investigators could examine his ideological background and determine whether it offered a plausible explanation. But they could not turn that possibility into certainty simply by assuming what he had been thinking. That distinction would remain important throughout the investigation. What was known was that Page had a history of involvement with white power circles, and that he had attacked a Sikh place of worship. What remained uncertain was the precise chain of thought that connected those two facts. The attack had begun in a place where people had gathered for worship and community. It ended with 6 worshippers dead, several people wounded, a police officer seriously injured, and the gunman dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In a matter of minutes, the ordinary life of the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin had been violently interrupted. The people inside had not expected to become part of a national story. Yet their names would soon be known far beyond Oak Creek. The investigation would move from the physical scene of the shooting into the history of Wade Michael Page. Searching for evidence that could explain what had happened, investigators would have to determine whether Page had acted alone, whether anyone had helped him, whether an extremist organization had played a role, and whether his ideological background could explain his choice of a Sikh temple. But before those questions could be answered, there was the simple and devastating reality of what had happened that morning. A community had gathered in its place of worship. A gunman had entered. 6 people had been killed. Others had been wounded. And the man responsible was already dead, leaving investigators to reconstruct the story from the evidence he had left behind. By the time law enforcement began arriving at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin on the morning of August 5, 2012, the situation had already become a mass casualty event. What had started as an ordinary Sunday gathering inside a place of worship had turned into an active shooting. People were dead, others were wounded, and somewhere at the scene, Wade Michael Page was still armed. The first responsibility of the responding officers was not to understand Page's ideology or determine his motive. It was to stop the immediate threat. One of the officers who arrived early was Lieutenant Brian Murphy of the Oak Creek Police Department. Murphy would become one of the most important survivors of the attack, not because he had witnessed the entire event, but because his encounter with Page helped bring the shooting to an end. The circumstances of that encounter were dangerous from the moment Murphy moved toward the gunman. Page had already opened fire on people around the Sikh temple and had continued toward the Gurdwara. The attack had already taken 6 lives: Paranjit Kaur, Prakash Singh, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Satwant Singh Kalika, and Suvig Singh. The temple was no longer simply a place where a crime had occurred. It remained an active and potentially deadly scene. Murphy moved toward the area where Page was located. The 2 men encountered each other outside the temple. There was no long confrontation described in the available account. Page responded by firing at the police lieutenant. Murphy was struck multiple times and seriously wounded. In those moments, Murphy became another victim of the attack. But unlike the 6 worshippers who had already been killed, he survived. His survival would later become one of the stories associated with the response to the shooting. Yet it is important not to let that survival overshadow the circumstances of what happened. Murphy had arrived because people inside the temple were in danger. He had entered a situation in which the gunman was still capable of causing more deaths. His injuries demonstrated the danger faced by the first officers responding to the scene. While Murphy was wounded, another officer continued the confrontation with Page. The second officer fired at the gunman and struck him. Page was wounded and disabled. At that point, the immediate threat appeared to have been stopped. But one crucial detail about the ending of the confrontation was not understood correctly at first. Initial reports indicated that Page had been killed by police gunfire. That appeared to be a straightforward explanation. Officers had confronted an armed attacker. One of them had shot him, and the gunman had died. But the FBI's later examination of the evidence established something different. Page had not died from the officer's gunfire. After being wounded and disabled, he took the handgun and placed it against his own head. He then fired. The fatal wound was self-inflicted. Wade Michael Page died at the scene. That distinction mattered because it changed the final moments of the attack and clarified what happened when police confronted him. The gunman had been wounded by an officer, but he ultimately caused his own death. There would be no arrest. There would be no interrogation. There would be no opportunity to ask him what he had intended when he arrived at the temple or why. He had selected the Sikh community as his target. For investigators, Page's death created a permanent gap in the case. The physical evidence could be examined. His background could be investigated. His relationships and ideological connections could be traced. But the person who knew his own final intentions was gone. Brian Murphy, meanwhile, had survived the encounter that could easily have killed him. His injuries were serious, and his survival became a significant part of the aftermath. He would remain in the public consciousness as one of the officers who confronted the attacker during the first police response, but the events surrounding Murphy were only one part of a much larger scene. The attack had already left 6 worshippers dead and 4 people wounded. Among the wounded was Murphy himself. Another victim, Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee, had suffered a severe head injury. He would survive the shooting but live with serious disabilities for years. The full human consequences of the attack, therefore, could not be measured simply by what happened in the minutes before Page died. Some consequences would continue for years. Murphy eventually recovered sufficiently to leave the hospital. He was discharged on August 22, 2012, more than 2 weeks after the shooting. His survival offered one of the few pieces of relief in an otherwise devastating account. But the fact that one person survived did not lessen what had happened to the others. 6 members of the Sikh community were dead. Their families had lost loved ones, and the community had lost people who had been part of its religious and social life. The police response also marked the beginning of another phase of the story. Once Page was dead and the immediate danger had ended, the scene became an investigative problem. Officers and investigators had to determine what had happened, where the victims had been located, how Page had moved through the area, and what evidence could explain the attack. The weapon used by Page would become part of that investigation. His history would become another part. His links to white supremacist and white power circles would become especially important because they raised questions about whether the shooting had been motivated by extremist ideology. But those questions could not be answered simply by looking at the scene. Investigators would need to examine the person behind the weapon. They would need to determine whether Page had acted alone or whether someone else had helped him. The possibility of a wider network was significant because Page had participated in bands associated with white power ideology, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. His background meant that investigators could not simply treat the shooting as an isolated act without examining his connections. At the same time, his ideological associations could not automatically prove that an organization had ordered or supported the attack. Those were separate questions, and the FBI would eventually investigate them separately. The police confrontation also established something important about the timeline of the attack. Page was still capable of using deadly force when officers arrived. He had already demonstrated that willingness by shooting Murphy. The intervention by law enforcement stopped him from continuing the attack. But the cost had already been immense. 6 Sikh worshippers had been killed, and several others had been injured. The temple itself had become the physical center of a tragedy that would soon attract national attention. In the hours after the shooting, the focus would begin shifting from immediate survival to understanding. Who was Wade Michael Page? What had brought him to the Sikh temple of Wisconsin? Why had he targeted people gathered for worship? Had anyone helped him? Was there a larger extremist organization behind the attack? And could the evidence establish an answer when the man responsible was already dead? Those questions would become the foundation of the federal investigation. The encounter between Brian Murphy and Page had helped end the immediate threat, but it did not end the mystery surrounding the attack. Murphy survived. Page did not. The victims whose lives had been taken could not be brought back. What remained was a crime scene, a dead gunman, wounded survivors, grieving families, and investigators who would have to reconstruct the story from what Page had left behind. In the days that followed, the focus would move deeper into the details, the weapon, the victims, the physical evidence, and most importantly, the life and ideology of Wade Michael Page. The shooting was over, but the search for an explanation was only beginning. Once the gunfire stopped at the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, the nature of the scene changed. For the people who had been trapped inside the violence, the immediate question had been survival. For the police and investigators arriving afterward, the questions were different. Who had been killed? Who was wounded? Where had the victims been when the shooting began? Where had Wade Michael Page moved? What weapon had he used? And what evidence could explain why he had come to the temple in the first place? The answers would have to be built carefully from the scene and from the life of the gunman. because Page himself was dead. There would be no opportunity to question him. There would be no statement from the accused explaining his actions. The crime scene, therefore, became the first place investigators could begin reconstructing what had happened. The Sikh Temple of Wisconsin had been a place of worship and community only minutes earlier. Now it had to be treated as an active crime scene. Investigators needed to establish the sequence of events and identify the victims. The final account would show that 6 Sikh worshippers had been killed during the attack. Their names were Paranjit Kaur, Prakash Singh, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Satwant Singh Kalika, and Suvig Singh. 6 people had lost their lives inside or around a place where they had gathered for religious and community activities. The numbers alone were stark: 6 murdered worshippers for wounded people, and the gunman himself dead. But the human reality behind those numbers was far more difficult. Each victim represented a family, relationships, memories, and a place within the Sikh community. Yet the information available for this account does not provide detailed personal biographies for each victim, and it is important not to fill those gaps with invented details. What can be said with certainty is that they were members of the Sikh community who had gathered at the temple that Sunday morning. Among them was Satwant Singh Kalika, 65, who had held a leadership role within the temple community. His death carried a particular significance because he was not simply present at the Gurdwara. He was an important figure within the community. His loss, therefore, affected the temple beyond the immediate grief of his family and friends. Another victim was Suvig Singh, 84, the oldest of the 6 people killed. His age emphasized the indiscriminate nature of the attack. The victims ranged from 39 to 84. They represented different generations, but they had been brought together that morning by the same community and the same place of worship. The crime scene also contained the evidence of the police response. Lieutenant Brian Murphy had been shot multiple times when he confronted Page. He survived, but his injuries were serious enough to require hospitalization. Another officer had confronted Page and shot him, wounding and disabling him. At first, this appeared to explain Page's death. Initial reports indicated that police fire had killed the gunman. But as the FBI examined the evidence, the final account became clearer. Page had not died from the officer's gunfire. After being wounded, he placed his handgun against his own head and fired. The fatal injury was self-inflicted. That fact became an important part of the official reconstruction of the final moments. The gunman's death also meant that the investigation would have to proceed without the person most capable of explaining the attack. Page could not be taken into custody. He could not be questioned about his plans. He could not be asked whether he had selected the temple because of its religious identity, whether he had acted from a broader ideological hatred, or whether some other motivation had been involved. Investigators could only examine the evidence available to them. One of the central pieces of that evidence was the weapon. Page had used a 9mm handgun. According to the information available in this case, the weapon had been purchased legally in Wisconsin. That detail became relevant because investigators were examining not only what happened at the temple, but also how Page had prepared for the attack. The fact that he possessed the weapon legally did not answer the question of why he used it. It did, however, form part of the broader investigation into his preparation and circumstances. Investigators also had to examine Page's personal history. He had served in the United States military and had received training in psychological operations. His military career had eventually ended after he was demoted and discharged. Later, he became increasingly involved in white power and white supremacist circles. He participated in bands associated with that ideology, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. These connections would become central to the question of motive. The crime scene could show what Page had done. His background might help investigators understand why he had done it. But those two forms of evidence had to be kept separate. A history of extremist involvement could provide a possible explanation for the attack, but it did not automatically prove that a particular organization had ordered it. That distinction would become one of the most important issues in the FBI investigation. The possibility of a wider conspiracy could not be dismissed simply because Page had died. Investigators needed to determine whether he had received assistance, whether someone had encouraged or directed him, and whether his relationships with extremist groups had any direct connection to the shooting. The FBI would eventually examine his relationships, his internet activities, his military history, and his contacts within extremist circles. The purpose was not simply to learn about Page as an individual. It was to determine whether the Sikh temple attack was the work of a lone extremist or part of a larger operation. At the same time, the investigators faced the difficult question of motive. Why would a man associated with white supremacist ideology choose a Sikh temple? The answer was not immediately established. Sikh communities in the United States had sometimes been affected by ignorance and mistaken assumptions about their religious identity. Some people unfamiliar with Sikhism have incorrectly associated Sikhs with Muslims or with Middle Eastern communities, but the available evidence does not allow us to state with certainty that this particular misunderstanding was the reason Page targeted the temple. What investigators could establish was that Page had a history of white power activity and that he had attacked a Sikh place of worship. The connection was significant, but the exact mental process behind his choice could not be recovered. His suicide had removed the possibility of a direct explanation. Another aspect of the aftermath was the long-term impact on those who survived. The immediate casualty figures could be counted, but not every consequence could be measured in a single number. Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee, had suffered a severe head injury during the attack. He survived, but his condition left him seriously disabled. For years, the consequences of that morning remained part of his life. When he died in 2020, authorities determined that his death was a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered in the shooting. His story demonstrated that the consequences of a mass shooting can continue long after the gunman is gone and the physical crime scene has been cleared. The temple would eventually return to being a place of worship and community. But August 5th could not simply be erased. The people who died could not return. The survivors carried injuries and memories. Families had to live with loss, and investigators had to continue examining the evidence in an attempt to understand what had happened. The crime scene could answer some questions. It could establish the immediate violence, the victims, the injuries, the weapon, and the final confrontation. But it could not answer everything. It could not explain the exact thoughts of Wade Michael Page. It could not tell investigators what he was thinking when he entered the temple. It could not reveal whether he had consciously selected the Sikh community because of its religious identity or whether some other thought process had been involved. Those questions would have to be approached through the evidence of his life. The physical scene told investigators how the attack unfolded. The victims established its human cost. The weapon demonstrated the means by which Page carried out the violence. And the gunman's background provided the next major avenue of investigation. As the FBI began examining Page more closely, the story moved away from the temple itself and toward the man who had entered it carrying a handgun. His military history, his later associations, and his involvement in white power music would become central to understanding the possible ideological context of the attack. But even as investigators followed those leads, one fact remained unchanged. The shooting had taken 6 lives. 4 people had survived with injuries, including Brian Murphy and another survivor. Baba Punjab Singh would carry devastating consequences for years. The crime scene could eventually be processed and cleared. The weapon could be cataloged. The official reports could be written. But for the people who had lost someone on August 5th, 2012, there was no simple procedure for returning life to what it had been before the gunfire. The investigation could reconstruct the sequence of events, but it could not undo them. And with Page dead, the most important remaining question, why, would have to be pursued through the traces of the life he had left behind. To understand the investigation into the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin shooting, investigators had to look beyond the morning of August 5th, 2012. The crime scene could establish what Wade Michael Page had done, but it could not fully explain why he had done it. Page was dead, and with his death went the possibility of a direct confession, an interrogation, or a courtroom explanation. If investigators wanted to understand the motive behind the attack, they had to reconstruct the life of the man who had carried the gun into the temple. What they found was a history that eventually became closely connected to white power and white supremacist ideology. Wade Michael Page was born in 1971. At some point in his life, he joined the United States military, serving as a member of the armed forces and receiving training in psychological operations. That part of his history was important because it showed that Page had once belonged to an institution built around discipline, training, and service. But his military career did not continue indefinitely. He was eventually demoted and discharged. The available information does not establish every reason behind the changes in his military career, and there is no basis here for turning that history into a simple explanation for what he would later do. Military service alone does not explain extremist violence. What mattered to investigators was what happened after Page's military career and how his later associations developed. Over time, Page became increasingly involved in a white power environment. He participated in bands associated with white supremacist ideology, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. These were not merely musical associations in the ordinary sense. They belonged to a wider environment in which music could be used to express and spread extremist ideas involving white supremacy, racial hatred, anti-Semitism, and white nationalism. Page's involvement with this environment became one of the most significant pieces of information investigators had when they began searching for a motive. The connection was disturbing, but it had to be understood carefully. The fact that Page participated in white power music did not automatically prove exactly what he had been thinking on August 5th. It did not, by itself, establish that he had been ordered to attack the Sikh temple. It did not prove that another organization had planned the shooting. It did, however, provide investigators with a clear ideological background that could not be ignored. The question was whether that background could help explain the choice of target. The Sikh Temple of Wisconsin was not a place with an obvious personal connection to Page. The available information does not identify a personal dispute between Page and the victims. There is no established conflict described in this account that would explain why he went to the temple. Instead, the attack appeared to raise a much broader question. Could Page's extremist beliefs have led him to target a religious minority community? That possibility became central to the investigation. The Sikh community itself was important to understanding the context. Sikh Americans have sometimes faced ignorance and mistaken assumptions from people unfamiliar with Sikh religious identity. Some people have incorrectly associated Sikh men and women with Muslims or with Middle Eastern communities. But that background should not be converted into an unsupported claim about Page's exact thought process. There is no direct statement from him explaining that he had mistaken the Sikh worshippers for another religious or ethnic group. Because he died during the attack, investigators could never ask him to explain his target selection. The distinction between evidence and assumption would therefore remain essential. Investigators could establish Page's extremist associations. They could establish that he attacked a Sikh temple. They could investigate whether the two were connected. But they could not simply invent a motive where the evidence did not provide one. His ideological history was a possible explanation, and an important one, but the exact contents of his mind remained inaccessible. Page's background also mattered because it raised another question, whether he was part of something larger. His involvement with white power circles meant that investigators could not assume from the beginning that the shooting was purely an isolated act. They had to determine whether another person had helped him, whether an extremist organization had supported him, or whether he had received instructions. If the shooting had been part of a wider conspiracy, the investigation would have needed to identify that conspiracy and those responsible. But if Page had acted alone, the evidence needed to establish that conclusion as well. The FBI therefore examined his relationships and connections, as well as his military history and his activities. His participation in white power bands gave investigators a network of associations to examine. His activities on the internet became another area of interest. The investigation was not simply about discovering whether Page held extremist beliefs. It was about determining how those beliefs related, if at all, to the decision to carry out a mass shooting. That distinction became particularly important because extremist ideology and criminal conspiracy are not the same thing. A person can belong to an extremist environment without receiving orders from an organization. A person can hold hateful beliefs without having a larger group direct a specific attack. Investigators therefore needed evidence rather than assumptions. Page's military history also had to be considered carefully. He had been trained in psychological operations, but there is no basis in the available information to claim that his military training caused or directly enabled the shooting. His service was simply one part of his biography. The more significant issue for the FBI was the later development of his extremist associations. The transition from former soldier to participant in white power music and extremist circles formed a troubling background against which the attack had to be understood. Yet, even with that background, important questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened inside Page's mind before he entered the Sikh temple? When did he decide that violence was the answer? Why did he select this particular Gurdwara? Had he considered other targets? Did he act because of a specific hatred towards Sikhs, because of a broader racist ideology, or because of some combination of beliefs and personal factors that investigators could never completely reconstruct? The available evidence could not answer all of these questions. Page's death made certainty impossible. What investigators could do was establish the facts surrounding him. He was 40 years old at the time of the attack. He had served in the military. He had been discharged after a career that included a demotion. Later, he became involved in white power and white supremacist circles and participated in bands associated with that movement. On August 5, 2012, he went to the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin carrying a 9mm handgun and began shooting. 6 worshippers were killed. 4 people were wounded, including Lieutenant Brian Murphy. Page was wounded by police and then died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The sequence was clear even if the deeper motive was not. The investigation, therefore, had to resist a natural temptation. The temptation to treat a disturbing background as a complete explanation. It was not enough to say that Page was a white supremacist and therefore everything about the attack was understood. The FBI had to determine whether his ideology connected directly to the attack and whether anyone else had participated. That process would take investigators beyond Page's biography and into his relationships, activities, and potential contacts. The eventual conclusion would be that he had acted alone and that investigators found no evidence say white supremacist organization had directed or directly assisted the attack. That conclusion did not make Page's ideological background irrelevant. If anything, it made the question of individual radicalization more troubling. The attack did not require an organization to be physically present at the temple. It did not require a group to hand Page the weapon or accompany him to the scene. A man with extremist beliefs had been capable of turning those beliefs into deadly action by himself. But even that conclusion required evidence, and the FBI would spend months examining the available information before reaching it. By the time investigators had begun to understand Page's background, the man himself was already beyond questioning. His life could be examined, but his final intentions could not. His associations could be traced, but his private thoughts could not be recovered. His ideological history could be documented, but the precise moment when belief became action remained hidden. That uncertainty would follow the case to its conclusion. Wade Michael Page's story, therefore, became a study not only of the attack itself, but of the difficult boundary between ideology and violence. Investigators knew that he had entered a Sikh place of worship and killed 6 people. They knew that he had a history within a white power environment. They knew that he had acted with a handgun and that he had ultimately died by suicide. What they still needed to know was whether anyone else stood behind him. That question would become the next major stage of the investigation, and answering it would determine whether the Sikh temple shooting was the work of one extremist or evidence of something larger. When the immediate violence at the Sikh temple of Wisconsin had ended, investigators were left with a difficult task. Wade Michael Page was dead, 6 Sikh worshippers had been killed, and several other people had been wounded. The physical attack was over, but the investigation had only begun. The central question was no longer how to stop the gunman. It was whether anyone else had been involved. Page had not appeared out of nowhere. He had a history, relationships, ideological connections, and activities that investigators needed to examine. The FBI, therefore, had to determine whether the shooting was the act of one extremist or whether it was connected to a larger white supremacist network. That distinction mattered. If Page had acted under the direction of another person or organization, the investigation could not end with his death. Whoever had helped plan, support, or direct the attack would also have to be identified. But if Page had acted alone, investigators needed evidence strong enough to support that conclusion. The investigation began at the scene of the shooting. The Sikh temple of Wisconsin had become the first source of evidence. Investigators had to reconstruct the sequence of events, determine where the victims had been, establish Page's movements, and examine the weapon he had used. The goal was to turn a chaotic scene into a documented timeline. The shooting had occurred within a relatively short period on the morning of August 5th, but every detail mattered. The position of the victims, the location of Page, the police response, and the circumstances of his death all had to be considered together. The weapon was another important part of the evidence. Page had used a 9mm handgun, which, according to the information available in this case, had been purchased legally in Wisconsin. Investigators therefore examined not only the weapon itself, but also the circumstances surrounding Page's possession of it. The existence of a legally purchased firearm did not explain the shooting, but it was part of the larger picture investigators were assembling. They also had to understand what Page had been doing before the attack. His military background was one area of inquiry. Page had served in the United States military and had received training in psychological operations. He had later been demoted and discharged. Investigators considered his military history as part of his biography, but the significance of that history had to be handled carefully. There was no basis for claiming that his military service itself explained his later violence. What mattered more to the investigation was the direction his life took afterward. Page became involved with white power and white supremacist circles and participated in bands associated with that ideology, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. Those connections immediately raised questions about motive and possible accomplices. Investigators examined Page's relationships with people in the extremist environment. They looked at his activities and internet presence and considered whether his contacts had played any role in the shooting. The question was not simply whether Page knew other extremists. It was whether anyone had helped him prepare for or carry out the attack. The FBI had to distinguish between association and conspiracy. A person could be connected to an extremist movement without being involved in a particular crime. Likewise, an organization could promote hateful ideology without having directed an individual member to carry out a specific attack. To establish a larger plot, investigators needed evidence that connected other people directly to the shooting. That evidence was not found. As the investigation continued, another question remained. Why the Sikh temple? Page's ideological history gave investigators an obvious avenue to explore. His white power associations made the possibility of a hate-motivated attack difficult to ignore. Yet the precise motive could not be established through a confession because Page was dead. Investigators, therefore, had to examine what his history could reasonably tell them. The fact that he had participated in white supremacist bands suggested a deeply troubling ideological background. The fact that he had then attacked a Sikh place of worship suggested a possible connection between that ideology, and his choice of target. But the investigation still had to determine whether the attack had been directed by a larger organization. That question remained separate from the question of Page's beliefs. The FBI also had to examine whether Page had communicated with anyone about his plans. His activities on the internet were therefore relevant. Investigators looked for information that could reveal preparation, communication, or coordination. They also examined his personal relationships and the people connected to his extremist activities. The objective was to identify any evidence that another person had encouraged, assisted, or directed him. The investigation was complicated by the fact that Page had died at the scene. His suicide removed the possibility of asking direct questions about his plans. Investigators could not confront him with evidence, test his explanations, or compare his account against the physical evidence. Every conclusion had to be drawn from what remained. That made the investigation both broader and more cautious. A suspicious connection could justify further inquiry, but it could not automatically become evidence of conspiracy. The FBI ultimately found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had directed the attack or provided Page with direct assistance. There was no evidence sufficient to establish that Page had been acting on orders from a larger extremist group. The conclusion was that he had acted alone. That finding did not mean that Page's extremist associations were irrelevant. On the contrary, they remained an important part of understanding the possible ideological context of the shooting. But the FBI did not find a larger organization behind the attack. The investigation, therefore, reached a conclusion that was both significant and disturbing. One person, acting alone, had been capable of carrying out the massacre. The absence of an organization did not make the attack less serious. It changed the nature of the questions surrounding it. If there was no larger conspiracy, then investigators and the public had to confront the possibility of individual radicalization. Page had developed connections to an extremist environment and eventually transformed those associations into deadly violence. Yet the exact path from belief to action could not be reconstructed completely. His history provided clues, but not a complete explanation. His ideological associations showed what kind of environment he had entered, but they did not reveal every thought behind the decision to attack the temple. The FBI's investigation, therefore, had to maintain a careful boundary between what could be demonstrated and what could only be suspected. Investigators could establish that Page had been connected to white power groups and music. They could establish that he had attacked the Sikh temple of Wisconsin. They could establish that he possessed the handgun used in the shooting. They could establish that he had shot 6 worshippers and wounded others. They could establish that he had fired on Lieutenant Brian Murphy and that he later died by suicide. And they could establish that they had found no evidence of organizational direction or direct assistance. But they could not recover Page's exact reasoning. They could not ask him why he chose the Sikh community. They could not determine every influence that had shaped his final decision. And they could not bring him before a court to explain himself. By November 2012, the FBI was prepared to conclude its primary investigation. The conclusion was clear: Wade Michael Page had acted alone. And investigators had found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had directed or directly supported the attack. That conclusion answered one of the most important questions of the case. But it did not answer every question. There was no larger plot to uncover, no network of accomplices to prosecute, and no organization to hold responsible for the specific attack. There was only the evidence surrounding one man who had entered a place of worship and killed 6 people. The investigation therefore ended where the story had begun, with Page himself. His military history, his later extremist associations, his weapon, his actions at the temple, and his suicide formed the known outline of the case. Around that outline remained a number of unanswered questions. The most important was still the simplest: why? The FBI could identify the ideological environment in which Page had operated. It could determine that he had acted alone. It could reconstruct the basic sequence of the shooting. But motive is not always something that can be proven simply by identifying a person's beliefs. Sometimes the final connection between belief and action exists only inside the mind of the person who acted. In this case, that person was dead. The Sikh temple investigation, therefore, became a case in which the evidence could establish responsibility without providing every answer about intent. Wade Michael Page was responsible for the attack. He had acted alone. He had killed 6 people and wounded others. But the exact reasoning that led him to choose that temple on that Sunday morning remained incomplete. The FBI had searched for a larger plot and found none. What remained was the unsettling conclusion that the violence had not required a visible organization behind it. One individual, shaped by an extremist ideological environment, had carried the violence into a community's place of worship. And because he died before he could ever be questioned, some of the most important questions would remain unanswered. Among all the questions surrounding the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin shooting, one remains particularly difficult to answer. Why did Wade Michael Page choose this place? The FBI could establish what happened on the morning of August 5, 2012. Investigators could identify the gunman, the victims, the weapon, the police response, and the circumstances of Page's death. They could examine his background and discover his connections to white power and white supremacist circles. They could investigate whether another person or organization had helped him. Eventually, they concluded that Page had acted alone and found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had directed or directly assisted the attack. But establishing responsibility was not the same as explaining motive. Page was dead. There would be no interrogation in which investigators could ask him why he had selected the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. There would be no statement from the gunman describing his thoughts as he approached the Gurdwara. There would be no courtroom testimony in which he could be confronted with the consequences of his actions. The exact reason for his choice of target, therefore, had to be approached indirectly, through the evidence of his life and ideology. The temple itself was not presented as the site of a personal dispute involving Page. The available information does not identify a conflict between Page and the 6 people he killed. There was no established personal relationship that could explain why he went there. Instead, the most significant clue came from the ideological world in which Page had become involved. He had participated in white power and white supremacist circles and had been associated with bands, including End Apathy and Definite Hate. Those associations placed him within an extremist environment characterized by racial hatred, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and white nationalism. For investigators, that history could not be ignored. It offered a possible connection between Page's beliefs and the religious community he attacked. But there is an important distinction between a possible explanation and a proven motive. Page's white supremacist background was evidence of his ideology. His attack on a Sikh temple was evidence of his choice of target. The two facts could reasonably be examined together, but they could not automatically reveal everything that had been happening inside his mind. This distinction is particularly important in a case where the perpetrator died before explaining himself. Investigators could study what Page had written, what he had participated in, the people with whom he had been associated, and the activities he had pursued. But none of those things could reproduce the private thought process that led him to the temple that morning. The investigation, therefore, had to remain cautious. One issue that became relevant was the fact that Sikh Americans have sometimes been subjected to misunderstanding because people unfamiliar with Sikhism have confused Sikhs with Muslims or associated them with Middle Eastern communities. Sikh identity is distinct, but ignorance and prejudice have sometimes produced mistaken assumptions about the appearance and religion of Sikh people. In the context of a white supremacist ideology, such misunderstanding could be relevant when investigators considered possible motivations for violence against a Sikh community. But the evidence available here does not establish that Page specifically believed the worshippers at the temple were Muslim. nor does it provide a direct statement from him saying that this misunderstanding influenced his decision. That possibility should therefore remain a possibility, not a fact presented as certainty. What investigators could say with greater confidence was that Page had a history of involvement in white power circles and that he had selected a Sikh place of worship as the scene of a mass shooting. Those facts created a troubling ideological context. They also raise questions about how extremist beliefs can influence the way individuals perceive people who belong to communities they consider different or threatening. Yet the case does not provide a complete psychological explanation for Page. There is no verified account in the available information that identifies the exact moment when he decided that a Sikh temple would be his target. There is no evidence presented here showing that he had previously visited the temple, that he had a personal grievance against its members, or that he had communicated a specific plan to attack that location. The absence of those details is significant. In true crime stories, there is often a desire to create a complete narrative in which every action has an identifiable cause. Real investigations are not always that complete. Sometimes the evidence establishes responsibility, but leaves motive only partially understood. The Sikh temple case is one of those situations. The ideological history of Page gives investigators an important avenue of explanation, but it does not remove every uncertainty. Another question was whether Page's choice of the temple had been connected to a larger extremist organization. If he had selected the location as part of a coordinated plan, investigators would have needed to identify the people who had supported him. They would have needed to establish communications, planning, assistance, or direction. The FBI therefore examined his relationships, his internet activities, his military background, and his connections to extremist circles. The investigation searched for evidence that could show whether Page had been acting on behalf of someone else. Ultimately, that evidence was not found. The FBI concluded that Page acted alone. That conclusion is important because it prevents another form of speculation. Page's involvement in white power circles does not mean that every organization with which he had any connection was responsible for the massacre. Investigators found no evidence that a white supremacist organization directed or directly supported the attack. The responsibility remained with Page himself. This also means that the question of motive cannot be answered simply by naming a movement. Saying that Page had been involved with white supremacy describes an important part of his ideological background, but it does not tell us precisely what he thought when he entered the temple. The difference between ideology and individual intent is critical. A person can exist within an extremist environment, absorb hateful ideas, and eventually act violently without receiving an order from anyone else. In Page's case, the FBI's findings indicate that this was an individual act rather than a coordinated attack. That conclusion makes the story unsettling in a different way. There was no larger organization that could be identified as the hidden hand behind the shooting. There was no chain of command that explained the attack. There was no accomplice waiting somewhere outside the temple. There was only Page, his weapon, his extremist associations, and the people he chose to attack. The absence of a larger conspiracy did not eliminate the ideological question. If anything, it brought that question closer to the individual. What happens when extremist beliefs become so deeply embedded that a person is willing to turn them into physical violence? At what point does hateful ideology stop being an abstract belief and become a plan? And what circumstances determine the moment when someone decides to act? The available evidence from the Sikh temple case cannot answer those questions completely. It can show that Page had moved within a white power environment. It can show that he ultimately carried a handgun into a Sikh place of worship and killed 6 people. It can show that investigators looked for evidence of a larger conspiracy and found none. But it cannot reconstruct every step between those facts. There is also a danger in allowing the attacker to become the center of the story. The more attention given to Page's ideology, history, and unanswered thoughts, the easier it becomes to lose sight of the people he attacked. The Sikh temple was not simply a location selected by a gunman. It was a place where people gathered to worship and participate in their community. The people killed that morning were not symbols created for Page's ideology. They were individuals: Paramjit Kaur, Prakash Singh, Sita Singh, Ranjit Singh, Satwant Singh Kalika, and Suvig Singh. Their identities existed independently of the beliefs imposed upon them by their killer. That is why the question of why the Sikh temple was targeted should be handled carefully. The answer may involve Page's extremist ideology, and that ideology is an essential part of understanding the case. But there is no evidence here that allows every detail of his motivation to be stated as fact. Some questions remain permanently unanswered because the only person who could have answered them chose to die rather than face interrogation or trial. What can be established is that Page had become involved in white supremacist and white power circles, that he attacked a Sikh place of worship, and that the FBI found no evidence of a larger organization directing the attack. The rest remains within the limits of what the evidence can tell us. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth of the case. Sometimes an investigation can identify the person responsible, reconstruct the violence, examine his beliefs, and still reach the final boundary of knowledge. On August 5, 2012, Wade Michael Page entered the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin and committed an act that devastated a community. Investigators would spend months searching for the explanation behind his choice. They would find a disturbing ideological background, but no larger conspiracy. They would identify a lone attacker, but not every reason behind his decision. And they would eventually have to accept that one of the most important questions, why this temple, why these people, and why that morning, could never be answered directly by the man who knew. The shooting at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin ended when Wade Michael Page died at the scene. But the consequences of the attack did not end with him. For the people who had survived, for the families of the 6 worshipers who had been killed, and for the wider Sikh community in Oak Creek, the morning of August 5, 2012, became a dividing line between what life had been before and what it would be afterward. The immediate violence had lasted only a short time, but the injuries, grief, and unanswered questions would remain for years. Among the most visible survivors was Lieutenant Brian Murphy, the Oak Creek police officer who had confronted Page during the attack. Murphy had been shot multiple times after approaching the gunman. His injuries were serious, yet he survived. His survival became an important part of the aftermath because his actions during the confrontation had helped prevent Page from continuing to attack others. Murphy was eventually released from the hospital on August 22, 2012. His recovery provided a measure of hope in a case dominated by loss, but it did not erase the circumstances that had brought him there. He had responded to an emergency and been met with gunfire. The fact that he survived did not change the reality that 6 Sikh worshippers had died before the attack was stopped. Another survivor faced a very different and much longer aftermath. Baba Punjab Singh, a Sikh grantee, suffered a severe head injury during the shooting. He survived the initial attack, but the injury left him seriously disabled. His condition became a long-term reminder that the consequences of the shooting could not be measured only by the number of people killed on August 5th. For years afterward, the physical consequences of the attack remained part of his life. In 2020, Punjab Singh died. His death was determined to be a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered during the 2012 shooting. His story extended the timeline of the tragedy by almost 8 years. For the community, the attack therefore did not belong entirely to one morning in 2012. Its consequences continued into another decade. The 6 worshippers who were killed were also more than names in an official casualty count. Paramjit Kaur was 41. Prakash Singh was 39. Sita Singh was 41. Ranjit Singh was 49. Satwant Singh Kalika was 65. Suvig Singh was 84. Their ages alone show the range of lives destroyed. Kalika had held a leadership role within the temple community, while Suvik Singh was the oldest victim at 84. The others were between 39 and 49. They had come to the Gurdwara for religious and community activities. Instead, their families received news of their deaths. The community had to confront the loss of people who had been part of its shared life. The significance of the location made the grief even more profound. A Gurdwara is a place of worship and community. On that Sunday morning, members had been preparing for religious activities and langar. The communal meal represented the ordinary rhythm of a community gathering. The shooting shattered that ordinary rhythm. The temple became associated not only with worship, but also with one of the most devastating acts of violence against a place of worship in the United States. Yet the identity of the Sikh community was not defined by the attack. The people who survived had to continue living, worshiping, and gathering in the same community that had been attacked. That process carried an important message. Violence had entered their sacred space, but it did not have the power to erase the community itself. The national response reflected the significance of what had happened. The attack drew attention far beyond Oak Creek and Wisconsin. It raised questions about white supremacist extremism, violence directed against religious minorities, the ability to recognize radicalization, firearms, and the response of law enforcement to domestic terrorism. The FBI's investigation had already established that Page had connections to white power and white supremacist circles. Yet investigators found no evidence that a larger organization had directed or directly assisted the attack. The conclusion that Page had acted alone became one of the most important findings of the case. It also created a difficult question for anyone trying to understand the broader threat. If a large organization had been responsible, investigators could focus on the network, its leadership, and its methods. But if one individual had carried out the attack independently, the problem was different. It required attention to the process by which an individual develops extremist beliefs and eventually decides to turn them into violence. Page's history demonstrated that the danger could not always be explained through a formal command structure. His extremist associations were real, but the FBI did not find evidence that a group had ordered the massacre. The attack, therefore, became an example of the destructive potential of individual extremist action. Public attention also turned toward the victim's religious identity. Sikhism is distinct from Islam, yet Sikh Americans have sometimes experienced prejudice based on mistaken assumptions about their appearance or identity. The shooting highlighted the vulnerability of a community that was not necessarily understood by the wider public. That misunderstanding became part of the national conversation following the attack. But even here, caution remained necessary. The available evidence does not provide a direct statement from Page explaining whether he specifically misunderstood the Sikh community or whether another aspect of his extremist worldview motivated his choice. His white supremacist background was an important part of the investigation, but his exact thoughts remained unknown because he died at the scene. The national response included expressions of sympathy from President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama. Their response reflected the broader recognition that the attack had affected not only one community in Wisconsin, but also the national conversation about religious tolerance and extremist violence. Michelle Obama later visited the Gurdwara on August 23, 2012. The visit occurred less than 3 weeks after the shooting and represented a public acknowledgement of the community's loss. Such gestures could not restore the lives that had been taken, but they demonstrated that the victims and the Sikh community had not been forgotten. The case also forced questions about the balance between religious freedom and physical security. A place of worship is ordinarily associated with openness and community. The tragedy demonstrated how vulnerable such spaces can be when an armed attacker enters them. The Sikh temple had not been designed as a battlefield. Its purpose was worship, gathering, and service. That was precisely why the attack carried such emotional weight. The violence violated the expectations associated with a sacred space. The investigation eventually reached its primary conclusion in November 2012. The FBI found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had supported or directed the attack. Page had acted alone. That finding effectively closed the central investigative question about whether a larger extremist conspiracy existed. But closing an investigation is not the same as closing the emotional story. There was no trial because the perpetrator was dead. There could be no sentencing and no courtroom confrontation. Families could not hear Page explain himself. Survivors could not question him. The community could not receive the kind of answers that sometimes emerge through a criminal prosecution. Instead, the case ended with a mixture of established facts and permanent uncertainty. What was known was enough to assign responsibility. Page was the gunman. He had killed 6 people, wounded others, shot Lieutenant Murphy, and ultimately died by suicide. What remained unknown was the exact inner reasoning behind his target selection and his final decision to attack. For the Sikh community, however, the story could not end with the unanswered questions about Page. The more important task was remembering the people who had been lost and continuing the life that the attack had interrupted. The names of the 6 victims remained connected to the temple and to the history of the community. Their deaths were part of a tragedy that had reached into families, friendships, religious life, and the shared identity of the Oak Creek Sikh community. The survival of the community after such violence was itself significant. The attack had attempted to turn a place of worship into a symbol of fear. But the people who remained continued to carry their community forward. The years after August 5, 2012, could not undo the tragedy. Brian Murphy would continue to live with the consequences of being seriously wounded. Baba Punjab Singh would live with severe disability until his death in 2020. Families would continue without loved ones. The temple would always carry the memory of the morning when 6 worshippers were killed. Yet the story was not only one of destruction. It was also a story about survival and remembrance. The gunman had died at the scene, but the community he attacked remained. And in the years that followed, the meaning of the Sikh temple shooting would increasingly depend not on the life of Wade Michael Page, but on the lives of the people whose lives he had taken and the community that refused to disappear with them. The shooting at the Sikh temple of Wisconsin ended on the morning of August 5, 2012, when Wade Michael Page died at the scene. But the story itself did not end there. For the Sikh community of Oak Creek, for the families of the 6 people who were killed, for the survivors, and for investigators who spent months trying to understand what had happened, the consequences continued long after the gunman was gone. The FBI eventually reached its primary conclusion: Page had acted alone, and investigators found no evidence that a white supremacist organization had directed or directly supported the attack. Yet that conclusion did not answer every question. In some ways, it created an even more difficult one. How could one individual, carrying a legally purchased handgun and operating without an organization behind him, transform extremist beliefs into an act that killed 6 people inside a place of worship? The investigation could establish responsibility. It could reconstruct the violence. It could trace Page's background and his connections to white power circles. But it could never completely reconstruct his mind. Page had no opportunity to explain himself. He was wounded by police during the confrontation and then placed his own handgun against his head and fired. The fatal wound was self-inflicted. There would be no arrest, no interrogation, no trial, and no testimony from the man responsible. That absence shaped everything that followed. In many criminal cases, the courtroom becomes a place where the accused is questioned. Evidence is challenged. Witnesses describe what they experienced. And the prosecution attempts to establish motive and responsibility. None of that could happen here. Page could not be brought before a judge. He could not hear the names of the people he had killed. He could not be asked why he had chosen the Sikh temple of Wisconsin. He could not be confronted with the consequences of his actions. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in reconstruction rather than confrontation. Investigators examined the crime scene, the weapon, Page's history, his relationships, his internet activity, his military background, and his associations with white power and white supremacist circles. Each piece of information helped create a picture of the attacker, but none could provide the certainty of his own testimony. The ideological evidence was particularly important. Page had participated in white power music through bands including End Apathy and Definite Hate. His association with extremist ideology was therefore not something investigators had to infer solely from the fact that he attacked a Sikh temple. It was part of his documented background. That history provided an important context for understanding the possibility that the shooting was motivated by extremist beliefs. Yet context was not the same as proof of every detail of his motive. The FBI could establish that Page belonged to an extremist environment. It could establish that he attacked a Sikh religious community. But it could not prove every thought that passed through his mind when he selected the target. This distinction remains essential. The available evidence does not establish that Page had a personal dispute with the victims. It does not establish a direct personal relationship between him and the temple community. It does not establish that a particular organization instructed him to attack. And the FBI found no evidence that an extremist organization had directly supported or directed the shooting. The conclusion was that Page acted alone. That finding was significant not only because it closed the question of a larger conspiracy, but because it demonstrated the limits of what investigators could ultimately know. There was no hidden command structure to expose. No accomplice remained to reveal the planning. No organization could be prosecuted for sending Page to the temple. The attack belonged to one individual. The consequences, however, belonged to many. 6 worshippers were killed. Paranjit Kaur, 41, Prakash Singh, 39, Sita Singh, 41, Ranjit Singh, 49, Satwant Singh Kalika, 65, and Suvik Singh, 84. Their ages spanned several generations. Kalika had served in a leadership role within the temple community. Suvik Singh was 84 years old. The others were between 39 and 49. They had entered a Gurdwara for religious and community activities. They became victims of an attack that had nothing to do with a personal conflict involving them. Their deaths altered families and affected an entire religious community. 4 other people were wounded during the shooting. Lieutenant Brian Murphy survived being shot multiple times when he confronted Page. He remained hospitalized until August 22, 2012, before being released. His survival became an important part of the story of the police response. Another survivor, Baba Punjab Singh, suffered a severe head injury. Unlike a wound that could be measured only in the immediate aftermath, his injury became a long-term consequence of the attack. He lived with serious disabilities for years before dying in 2020. His death was determined to be a homicide connected to the injuries he had suffered during the 2012 shooting. His story is a reminder that the aftermath of violence does not always follow the calendar of the original crime. For some victims, the attack continues through physical injuries, disability, grief, and memories long after the gunfire has stopped. The shooting also changed how many Americans viewed the vulnerability of religious communities. A Gurdwara is a place of worship and fellowship. Members of the Sikh community gathered there for religious activities and langar, a communal meal. The attack demonstrated how an ordinary gathering could suddenly become a scene of mass violence. It raised difficult questions about domestic terrorism, extremist ideology, firearms, the identification of radicalization, and the protection of religious minorities. It also highlighted the problem of misunderstanding Sikh identity. Sikh Americans have sometimes been subjected to prejudice because people unfamiliar with Sikhism have incorrectly associated Sikhs with Muslims or other communities. But the evidence in this case does not allow us to say with certainty that such a misunderstanding was Page's specific reason for attacking the temple. His white supremacist ideology remains an important part of the context, but the precise mechanism that connected his beliefs to the choice of this particular target cannot be fully established. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is also part of responsible true crime storytelling. The temptation is always to provide a clean answer. Viewers and listeners want to know why the killer acted. They want a motive that explains the entire crime. But sometimes the evidence does not provide one complete explanation. In this case, the gunman died before he could answer. The FBI investigation ended with a clear finding about one important question. Page acted alone. It did not end with a complete psychological portrait of him. That distinction should remain intact. The story should not turn Page into a mysterious figure whose personality overshadows the people he killed. He was responsible for the violence, but he should not become the central human figure of the tragedy. The central human figures were the victims and the people who survived. They were the ones whose lives were changed without their consent. They were the ones who had to continue after August 5th. The national response reflected the significance of the attack. President Barack Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama expressed condolences to the Sikh community. On August 23, 2012, Michelle Obama visited the Gurdwara. Such gestures could not repair the loss, but they acknowledged that the tragedy had national importance. The shooting was no longer only an event in Oak Creek. It had become part of the American conversation about religious tolerance, hate, extremism, and violence. Yet perhaps the most important part of the aftermath was less political and more human. The Sikh community continued. The temple remained a place associated with worship and community life. The attack had interrupted that life, but it did not destroy it. The 6 people who died could not return, and the survivors could not simply erase what had happened. But the existence of the community after the shooting demonstrated that the story did not belong entirely to the person who had tried to destroy it. Years later, the case remains unsettling because its final answers are incomplete. We know who carried out the attack. We know where it happened. We know when it happened. We know that 6 Sikh worshippers were killed, that others were wounded, that Lieutenant Brian Murphy survived, that Baba Punjab Singh carried severe injuries for years, and that Page ultimately died by suicide. We know that the FBI investigated the possibility of a wider white supremacist conspiracy and found no evidence that an organization had directed or directly assisted him. We know that Page had a history of involvement in white power circles, but we cannot know everything he was thinking when he entered the Sikh temple of Wisconsin that morning. We cannot ask him why he chose those people. We cannot know the exact moment when his beliefs became an intention to kill. And we cannot change what happened to the 6 victims. What remains is their names, their community, and the record of what was done to them. The tragedy of August 5, 2012, should therefore not be remembered only as the story of Wade Michael Page. It should be remembered as the story of 6 people whose ordinary Sunday ended in unimaginable violence, of survivors who carried the consequences, of a police officer who confronted the attacker and lived, and of a Sikh community that continued after losing members of its own. The investigation may have closed, but remembrance does not require every question to have an answer. Sometimes the most honest ending is to acknowledge what can be proven, what cannot, and who deserves to remain at the center of the story. In Oak Creek, the gunman is gone. The unanswered questions remain. But so do the names of the people who were there that morning. And ultimately, those names are what should endure.